continues our lecture on research ethics. And to remind you what we're doing, we're going through 4 different areas in which qualitative research produces particular kinds of challenges in terms of research ethics. And we're thinking about them in terms of challenges that there might be for procedural ethics, so for seeking approval from an ethics committee, and areas where those challenges might be in terms of producing a problem in the kind of everyday practice of the research and having to make decisions about what to do. So the first area that we're going to look at is that qualitative research is a flexible and iterative process. So as we talked about in the first couple of weeks, qualitative research is by design dynamic, reflexive, and iterative. So that can mean that the research design may emerge or change as the process of the research goes on. We might have a very open research question, and we certainly want to start in a very open way in our research. And so that research question or the particular focus of the research may shift or become tighter as the research goes on. Sampling, recruitment, and data collection methods may change during data collection and analysis, and that very idea can be very challenging to some ethics committees if what they mostly see is medical research or quantitative research. Flexibility can also mean that unexpected ethical issues can arise, so we might not have anticipated interviewing particular types of people, and then that might change as we're looking to engage with different kinds of groups. So lots of challenges there in terms of procedural ethics. And so our strategies for dealing with that are to acknowledge that an ethics committee might be not very familiar with qualitative research, and so part of our job might be to explain the logic of qualitative research, the logic of the particular methodology that we're using, and to explain what the benefits of that are. And to be really clear about where there's flexibility and where things are emerging and where we can provide detail that we're confident about. Another strategy that people use is to seek stepped ethical approval for emergent designs. So you might, instead of seeking approval for the entire project, you might just seek approval for stages and where each stage informs the next one. So as you become confident about what the next stage is going to look like, then you go back to the ethics committee for additional approval. One area that I think sometimes ethics committees have a misunderstanding is about what the function of an interview schedule or a focus group schedule or an observation guide is. And I've had quite a lot of conversations with people who sit on ethics committees who don't understand qualitative research and think that the list of questions in an interview guide is precisely the questions and the only questions that will be asked. And they are uncomfortable about the idea that you might be asking different kinds of questions. Now, we've spent quite a lot of time on this course, especially in the weeks when we looked at interviewing, talking about how important it was to use probing and orienting to the specific and different techniques to encourage people to produce deeper and richer data. So that's a different idea to what we might see in a quantitative survey, when we can be very clear with an ethics committee, here is exactly the questions and the only questions that we will ask. So you might, again, depends on the committee, need to explain the logic that an interview schedule is a guide for a conversation rather than the rule book for the conversation. Some committees might might be more or less comfortable with that. When it comes to changes in sampling, we can also seek modifications from a committee, and that's a perfectly acceptable thing to do in the process. So the second area that we can see some difficulties coming up is around the logic of qualitative research samples. And we talked quite a lot about sampling in the second week. And a reminder that in qualitative research, purpose of sampling is the main sampling approach that we use. So this is where participants or sites for observation are chosen because they are particularly useful or rich sources of information for understanding the phenomenon of interest. So they will help generate data that will address our research question. We aren't sampling for representativeness. And again, depending on the ethics committee, there's a good understanding of this. Some ethics committees have forms that presume representative sampling, and so they ask you to justify the numbers that you're going to generate and to explain the logic for those numbers. So they're looking for a power calculation. So having to, again, just clearly explain what the logic of the sampling is and how it will help you address your research question. If you don't have an exact size of how many people you're going to try and speak to, and you're unlikely to, again, explaining what the logic is for stopping. So how will you know when you've collected enough data? And we've talked a bit about that in this course. And the national statement is very supportive of this. So it says the recruitment strategy for a project should be relevant to the research methodology, the topic, subject matter, the potential participants, and the context. So it's important to use the national statement to explain to ethics committees why it is that you're doing the things that you're doing and how it makes sense in the methodology that you're using. So outlining a clear argument for your recruitment strategy, for your sampling strategy, explaining when and why recruitment will cease, so whether that's around theoretical saturation or thematic saturation. If you're generating data and doing analysis at the same time, then you have a very neat way of explaining a very systematic process that you're going to use to judge when you have enough data. And it's important here to demonstrate a coherence between your research question and your sampling strategy. So your research question should be suggesting the kind of data and then potentially the kind of people that you need to speak to. So an ethics committee should be able to see that. So most of what we've talked about so far has been about challenges in terms of procedural ethics. The third area, the researcher-participant relationship, is an area where a lot of the challenges, it's both. So you'll have some procedural ethics challenges, but you'll also have quite a lot of ethically important moments arising. Again, the national statement acknowledges some challenges here. So some methodological approaches require careful boundaries to be maintained between researchers and research participants. So that would be, for example, a randomized control trial or an experimental study. In contrast, other research fields require data collection methods that involve the development of a close personal relationship with participants or degrees of collaboration that blur the lines between researchers and participants. So that would be participatory or action research. So in these two extremes, I guess, in the middle is more commonly where qualitative research is. So some qualitative research, longitudinal or ethnographic, you might have sustained opportunities for developing close personal relationships between participants and researchers. But most qualitative research is sometimes disparagingly called hit and run. So you're just doing one interview or one focus group with people, but you still have opportunities to get to know quite a lot about them. So some of the challenges that can come up here are around the idea that in qualitative research, the relationship or the interaction between the participant and the researcher is how the data is generated. And so you matter a great deal. So some of the things that can come up here are issues, for example, around distance and ignorance. So if you are very different, you have very different life experiences, very different identity, and very different positioning in the world in terms of power or social standing or financial capacity to your participants, then there's a potential that that distance creates some ignorance, and that in engaging with them in data collection, you may be insensitive or even offensive and potentially unsafe. Not by intent, but that you might just not understand or appreciate the perspective of the participant. So the way that you engage, the kind of questions that you ask, the way you react to what the participant says may create difficulties. On the other hand, if you share a lot of experiences or identity or social and economic positions with your participants, then that closeness can give you shared understandings. And that can be good, but it can also create different kinds of problems where you assume you know what they mean, and you assume that you share experiences, and the participants assume those things also, which can mean that you're not following up or you're not investigating issues with them. A perhaps more familiar idea to people in quant research and in medical research is the idea of having multiple roles. So a lot of clinicians will be engaged in research, and so there's a kind of an awareness around thinking about what those multiple roles might mean, how you navigate issues around boundaries in terms of navigating those roles. We can also sometimes have existing relationships with our participants, not just because we're a clinician. So we might know them from other contexts, particularly if you're a practitioner and you're doing research in your area. And that can create some problems for the participant. They may feel embarrassed and may be reticent to share information. They may feel a social obligation or coercion to participate because you've asked and you know them, and so you have an existing relationship. So quite a mix of procedural and ethically important moments in practice there. And if we think about how to resolve these things, offering participants options in terms of who interviews them can be quite important. So it might be that a like interviewer, so somebody who shares their culture or their experience or their socioeconomic position, might be a good option for some people. But I've certainly been involved in research myself where people actually wanted somebody who didn't come from their community to do the interviewing. It felt more safe to them because they were worried about judgment or confidentiality. So having those options, and that's something that we can, sometimes ethics committees can have a particular idea about the right people to do the interviews, and I think it's good to have, to articulate in an ethics application who's doing the interviews and why they're a good person to do them, and if there are concerns about the relationship to the participants or shared experiences or non-shared experiences, then to actually address them directly in the ethics application. Hands-off recruitment is something which we're very familiar with in medical research, so the idea that clinicians don't directly recruit their own participants. Clinicians don't directly recruit their own patients as participants. And there's it's quite common to use hands-off recruitment in all kinds of research now. Another strategy we can use, and this is much more about ethically important moments, is reflexive journaling. So that's a space for researchers to think about the kinds of issues that are coming up in terms of the relationship between them and the participants. So are there particular kinds of people that you're finding challenging or you're more interested in, or that might be bringing up issues for you or challenging your particular ideas about the research? I think it's good to think in terms of procedural ethics about discussing with potential participants and community or community representatives about what is culturally safe in terms of data collection. So who are the kinds of people who might be more comfortable or safer or more accepting for participants? And this really is contextual, so it depends on the kind of research you're doing. But I think it's good to be able to demonstrate to an ethics committee, but also for the benefit of your research and your participants, that you've thought about these kinds of issues. In the actual process of data collection, we can negotiate with participants around our roles, and we talked a little bit about this in terms of interviewing and the potential for clinicians to slip into a problem-solving, motivational interviewing role in an interview when the whole point of an interview is to collect data rather than to solve a problem. And so we can navigate that in all kinds of data collection scenarios where we need to be really clear as researchers. And reflexivity will be really important here, and we'll talk about that in future lectures, about being really clear about what's our role and attending to when we might be shifting, and to be clear with a participant that I'm not going to to say to them if they're asking you to shift roles, to say, look, can we hold off on discussing that particular issue and let's do that after the interview, and then I can put my clinical hat on, for example.